Alright, so today we are going to set up an HTTP kernel. And so this is better shown through example than kind of trying to explain why we're doing it. You'll kind of see as we go on why we're doing this. But basically a kernel is the first step into the application. The kernel is responsible for booting up either the HTTP request, the console request, maybe it's a WebSocket, broadcast request. You have a different kernel for each type of request. That's the simplest way to really get down to it. So the first thing we're going to do is in our composer.json, we're going to add a new namespace. This namespace is going to be boot //, and we're going to point this to the bootstrap directory. Once we add that namespace, we're going to run composer dump autoload-o so we can use that new namespace. So while that's dumping the autoload, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to our bootstrap directory, and we are going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this foundation. This is the foundation of our application. Then we're going to create a new PHP class, and we're going to call this the kernel. After that, we are going to create a new HTTP kernel. And then we are going to create a new directory called Bootstrappers. And that is supposed to be a directory, so let's delete that real quick. And this is going to be Bootstrappers. Within this directory, we are going to create 4 new files. The first one is going to be the Bootstrapper base class. After that, we're going to create a new load environment variables. Then we're going to create another file. This is going to be called load HttpRequests. Next, we're going to create one more file, and this is going to be called load ServiceProviders. So these are going to be the things that really shouldn't be in ServiceProviders. They should be before ServiceProviders. Okay. So the first file we're going to open is our kernel. Within our kernel, we're going to define 3 methods and 2 properties. The first one is going to be a public app. It's going to use the slim app. So app has to be of type slim app. Next, we're going to define an array of bootstrappers. We're just going to call this bootstrap and then make that an array. This is going to register application bootstrapper loaders or bootstrap loaders. Let's do that. After that, we're going to create our constructor. Constructor is going to accept an instance of slim app and reference our already created app. We're going to set this app to app, and then we're going to say this app, we're going to get the container, and we're going to set a new key that is going to be this class, this kernel. We're going to set this. So children will be able to extend from this. So this might be HTTP kernel. It might be just the traditional kernel. It actually won't be traditional kernel because we're going to make this abstract real quick. So for this tutorial, this is actually going to be the HTTP kernel. And then we're going to say, okay, bootstrappers, and bootstrappers are going to act a lot like service providers. They're going to be bootstrappers / bootstrapper, and then set up this app with this bootstrap list. And this bootstrap list is going to be overridden by the specific type of kernel. So again, it's going to be like HTTP kernel, console kernel. It's going to be the type of request coming into our application. There's a different kernel based on the type. Okay, so then after that, we're going to have to create this bootstrapper class still. But we're going to do public static function. We're going to do this nifty get application function. Very nifty. This will just make it a little cleaner on the front side, and then we'll do app, and we'll just return this app. Very, very fancy. It gets the app, obviously. So it's literally, this class is literally going to construct itself, create itself, run through our bootstrappers, and then pass the app in. It's also going to register itself to the service container. Not too confusing. So then in our HTTP kernel, we're going to extend our kernel. So within our HTTP kernel, we're going to have a few extra things. Our HTTP kernel is going to be responsible for registering middleware, specifically non-route specific middleware. So route groups, what middleware goes on groups of routes, what middleware is global, etc. So public array middleware, this will be global middleware. This will be route group middleware. And this is going to be middleware groups. We'll say API is going to be that, and then web is going to be that. And then we're going to add a public array of bootstrappers. And that's going to be bootstrap, just like that. So all we're going to do is we're going to say bootstrappers, and then we're going to do load environment variables. We're going to bootstrap our environment variables class. Next, we're going to bootstrap our load HTTP middleware class. Finally, we are going to bootstrap our actual service providers. We're going to load our service providers. All right. After that, we need to actually go to our bootstrap, and then we're going to go to our bootstrapper class. Our bootstrapper class is also going to use SlimApp. It's going to set, and this is going to be very similar to our service providers. We're going to say final public function construct, reference our existing app using this ampersand. We're going to use a reference. And then we're going to say loaders equals array map function loader. So we're going to map each of our loader classes again. Our loaders are just going to be a list of strings to our class path. So we actually need to instantiate our loaders. And all we're going to do is we're going to say function loader, and then we're going to say new loader. We're going to pass it the app. And it's going to map based on the loaders. And the loaders are going to be the second parameter, array of loaders. After that, we are going to do this array walk, and we're going to hit our lifecycle events. We're going to do bootstrapper boot, and then we're going to do boot before boot. And then we're going to add 3 more methods. We're going to do before boot, boot, after boot. And then, of course, we're going to add public function before boot. We're going to add public function boot. And then public function after boot. Also notice I made my service provider methods and our providers right here. I made the service provider lifecycle hooks register and boot. I made those abstract. I'm not doing that with our bootstrappers, mainly because bootstrappers, we're not going to have to make too many of them. Once we have our loader set up, once we have everything set up for bootstrapping our app, we shouldn't have to touch it like ever. Now that's a little different because we're setting it up within Slim, but once you really have the bootstrapping of your HTTP kernel, bootstrapping of your console kernel or broadcast/channel kernel, you shouldn't have to touch the bootstrappers. You should set them up once. So that's why I make the service providers abstract, so when new developers that aren't familiar with the code base dive in, they'll probably make service providers. Literally, there shouldn't be anybody touching these bootstrappers. So that's the difference. Okay, so now we're going to refactor some of our service provider functionality to our bootstrappers. So first we're going to do extends bootstrapper. This can be in our load environments variable. Then we're going to do public function boot. And then we're going to go to our environment variables. We're going to copy this. And this is our environment variable service provider. Now we're just calling it load environment variables. We use the imports just like that. And voila. That is good to go. We can delete our environment variable service provider. Then we'll go to our config app and we will delete it here. Just like that. Load environment variables. Okay. Next, we are going to go to our load service providers. Our load service providers is going to also extend our bootstrapper. Then we're going to do public function boot. Then we're going to do service provider, set up this app. Remember, the parent, the bootstrapper, sets this app. We're going to say config app.providers and la. Okay. After that, we are going to go to our load HttpMiddleware, and then we are going to do another public function boot, and then we're going to do this. And this is why we need to set our kernel to our container. Right here in the constructor, we get the app container and we set self-class. When we're in kernel, we bind the kernel to the service container. In our load HttpMiddleware bootstrapper, first we need to extend bootstrapper, and then what we're going to do is we're going to do kernel equals this app get container, and then we're going to do get the kernel class. And then we need to just do use boot /foundation/kernel. And so what's cool about this, since we're binding the key to kernel, it doesn't matter if it's an HTTP, console, whatever kernel we're using at the time. There's usually only 2 or 3, if that. But there can be up to 2 or 3 kernels. They're never used at the same time. We're either going to use the console, like the terminal kernel, like down here, or we're going to use the HTTP kernel, like the HttpRequests. We're binding both of those kernels to the same key because we only use one kernel at a time. So we can always get the kernel by resolving based on the kernel class, which is the key we use to resolve the kernel that we are currently using. So pretty hefty concept there, but if you call it that one, that's hugely important and very useful. Okay, so now that we have the kernel, what we're going to do is we're going to do this app get container. We're going to do set the middleware, and then we're going to set middleware, the key of middleware. We're going to say global middleware is going to be the kernel middleware. Because we're returning the specific instance we're currently using, we're actually going to get this array. This is going to be our global middleware, and so it's going to be middleware and middleware groups, kernel middleware and kernel middleware groups. So if we go back to load HTTP kernel middleware, and then API is going to be kernel middleware groups API, and then web is going to be kernel middleware groups web. Okay. And then we need to add one more bootstrapper. This is going to be our last bootstrapper, and this bootstrapper is going to be load debug options or load debugging page. Add that. So the order that we define or register our bootstrappers does matter. Extends bootstrapper. So here's why it matters. We want to also move this error page right here. And we want to add load debugging page. So we're going to add public function boot. We're going to do if env app debug, then this app adds the whoops middleware. That's our pretty debug page. That was our last lesson that we went over that, right? But this will always be false unless we've loaded our environment variables. So we need to load our environment variables first. And so to do that, all we have to do is we have to go to this bootstrap array in our HTTP kernel class, and we can do bootstrappers /load environment variables, and then we do bootstrappers /load debugging page. So we always have to load our environment variables first. Very important. More than that, though, we could always go to load environment variables, do that, and then we could go load debug options, and we could do after boot. And that way, if it is out of order, then the order does not matter as much in here. But personally, I like adding them all at the boot. That just helps out a little bit. And more specifically than that, I always like adding them in this order. Load environment variables, load debugging page. That way, if anything else breaks in our while we're loading, we'll still get the pretty more informative debugging whoops page. And then if anything breaks in our service providers, we will always get our debug page properly set up. So there we go. The last thing I can think of, so let's clean this up a little bit. Yeah, I think we're good to go. So load service providers, and load service providers always make that last. Okay. The last thing we need to do is we need to go to app HTTP. And then we're going to create this new PHP class. We're going to call it HttpKernel. HttpKernel is going to actually extends the use boot/foundation/HttpKernel as kernel. We're going to extend the foundation HttpKernel. And since we're importing it as kernel, we can extend it. Now here's why. HttpKernel, we're going to copy these two properties. This is going to be our middleware and our middleware groups. So now whenever we want to add global middleware, we can just reference the class. So we're going to create a new PHP, we're going to create a new directory and we're going to call it middleware. And then within our middleware, we're going to create two new middleware. So we're going to call this example AfterMiddleware. And then we're going to do new PHP class example before middleware. Okay, so in our example after middleware, we'll start there. We need to do public function invoke and then request, and then handle. Now we're going to use PSR HTTP server request server, and then we're going to say request handler interface as handle, the second parameter, and we're going to use PSR HTTP/message/server request interface as request, and that will be our first properly spelled parameter. Okay, so example after middleware. How do you create middleware that runs after the controller returns your response? Well, you do this. You do response equals handler, and the handler will handle the request, and that will be our response. Next, we're going to say response get body write, and then we'll do /n after middleware. Then we will, of course, return our response. So this just means that we will handle our request through our controller, through our anonymous callback function, and then we will do something with our response, and then we'll return it. So this is handled after our controller handles our request. That's why it's called after middleware example. Okay, so now we're just going to copy this over right here, and we're going to add this to our before middleware. That will ask us to import it. We'll say OK. And then within our before middleware, we actually need to return the response, and the response is going to be slim/psr7/response. So the biggest difference here is that we're still going to handle our response, and then we're going to say the content equals string response get body, just like that. And this is going to be existing content, or existing, let's just call it existing body. And then we'll do response equals new response. Then we'll do response get body, and then we're going to write before, and then we're going to say content, or existing body. Just like that. After that, we will simply return our response. So this happens before our request. It doesn't really happen before. It lets us append something or prepend something to our request. This lets us append or do something after our request. So now within our HTTP kernel, we can do this. We can add global middleware. And this will be like example after middleware class and example before middleware class. And then we just have to do middleware and middleware. And let's remove that import. Okay, and that's our HTTP kernel. Now the last thing that we need to do to really get this set up, and it's not really the last thing, but that sounds nice, is we need to go to our app and we need to remove our AirMiddleware. And so within our foundation load debugging page, we're doing this. So we can get rid of our AirMiddleware. So in config app, we'll remove our AirMiddleware. And so now we're down to two very simple service providers, our Blade service provider and our Route service provider. Next, we need to actually implement or utilize our kernel. To do this, we need to go to bootstrap/app. And then within bootstrap/app, we're going to open up our imports. And what we're going to actually do is we're going to change this from slim app factor, we're going to call this app. Next, we're going to completely remove our service provider. We don't need to do that anymore because we're doing that in our Bootstrap loader. And then we can simply do app create. Then we're going to do return HttpKernel. And this is going to be in our app/http/httpKernel. Just like that. So we need to use app HttpHttpKernel. And we're going to do HttpKernel bootstrap app create with the new container get application. We're going to return that just like that. All right, and so finally, in our HttpKernel, we are extending HttpKernel. Then within our foundation kernel, we are using our constructor. So within Bootstrap/index, we actually need to do new HttpKernel. And then we need to do passing it our new app. Just like that. Sorry guys, bad typing. Okay, we're going to do this. We're going to just call this app. App equals that. And then we need to do new HttpKernel with the app. And then get application. Just like that. With one more parentheses. Okay, but we're going to clean that up even a little bit more. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our kernel. And instead of using a new keyword right there, in our Bootstrap app, we're using new HttpKernel. We're just going to go to our kernel, and we're just going to say public static function bootstrap. And we're going to say app references app. And then we're just going to return a new static and then app. That's just going to return a new instance of itself. So it's going to call the constructor. So this static method is going to call the constructor, giving us a new instance because we're using new static. And now we can replace that with return HttpKernel bootstrap app get application, just like that. And then because it's a little bit cleaner, we can get rid of that first line. And we can just do HttpKernel app create new container get application. And so now we are using our kernel to bootstrap everything. So if everything worked right, which it didn't, then we should get it working properly. .php line 7. Okay, so we do need to set this to app because only variables can be passed by reference. So we need to make that app, and we need to do HttpKernel bootstrap app get application. That way we can pass it by reference without copying all the app data. Call to undefined boot bootstrapper setup. Where's that at? Call to undefined method boot foundation bootstrappers bootstrapper setup in user foundation kernel line 25. All right, so in kernel line 25, we need to do bootstrappers bootstrapper and we need to make this a, ooh, that's where we went wrong. So final public static function setup is going to be right there, and the final public function construct app, and then app. So setup is actually going to trigger or map through or loop through the list of bootstrappers right there, and it's going to call the constructor. And all the constructor is going to do is it's going to set this app. So we use setup to loop through all of the bootstrappers in the static setup function, we instantiate a new class, which is where the constructor sets the app. So, and then it just loops through and it calls before boot, boot, and after boot on all the Bootstrappers. Okay, now let's see if that works properly. And there it goes. All right. So, what was the purpose of all of that? That was a lot of stuff. And if you guys want to just copy the GitHub along this, feel free to. I know we're getting some pretty intense stuff here. I will post the GitHub repo link below. But check this out. We are about to add very, very powerful functionality for middleware. So middleware is going to need, for validation specifically, authentication. If we're doing API authentication or we're doing web authentication, we're going to need two different things. Web will need the SRF token, it will need session. We'll need to pass the errors to the session and display them on the front end. API routes will need to be like returned with JSON. They'll need to throttle, which means they'll have to limit the amount of requests that are allowed to hit our API in a given amount of time, so people aren't trying to send 10 million requests to our server and knocking down our site. So there's a lot of different authentication things we need to implement within Slim based on a route determined by if it's an API route or if it's a web route. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a new class. We're going to call this route group. Now route group is going to allow us to dynamically create route groups in a route service provider. So it's going to accept an app, it's going to accept a route prefix, it's going to accept a file where we require the routes from. So for example, the routes property will reference routes/web.php. We'll add a new file in here right now too as well. And we'll call it api.php. And then all we'll do is we'll say, okay, use app support route. And then all we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, example, and then we'll do API controller at index. We'll remove that for now. Go to controllers, we'll make a new controller real quick. We'll call that API controller. And then within API controller, we'll create a public index callback action. Public function index. And then all we'll say is response, and then we'll just return, we'll say response get body, right, and then we're going to say JSON encode hello world, and then with the second parameter of JSON encode we'll say JSON pretty print, just like that, and we forgot the underscore. Okay, and then we'll return the response, and voila. We have an API controller with a single index route. Within our routes API, we are hitting the API controller index at example. But we want to make it actually API/example without needing to add the API in every single API route. It's the api.php routes file. It should always have API on it. So what we're going to do is within our route group, we're going to add route groups. And each route group is going to have a reference to app. Each route group is going to have a prefix. So the API route group prefix is going to be /API. Each route group is going to load its own files. So the web route group will load web. The API route group will load api.php. Next, each route group will have a specific set of middleware, and they'll have shared global middleware. Okay, so that's all each route group will have. They'll have a prefix, routes, and middleware. They'll know about the app so they can create themselves. So first we need to do public function construct. We're going to do and app. We cannot make this a Slim app. Sometimes this is actually going to be a route collector proxy. So we can't do Slim/app. Won't work this time. We just need to make it app. And all we're going to do is we're going to say this app equals app. Then we're going to do public function prefix, and this pattern is going to be the same. It's just a fluent API. This prefix equals route, and we'll just say prefix, just like that. Public function routes path is going to equal that. We're going to say this route equals path, return this, And then we're going to do public function middleware, array of middleware. We're just going to say this middleware equals middleware. And then we're going to say return this. As you can see, same pattern, guys. This route equals this. Prefix, we forgot to return this. This is just making a fluent API a pretty API. And then finally, we're going to have this register. And what this register is going to do is it's going to use all the stuff we built up in the previous functions, and it's going to say the group equals this app group. And then we're going to say prefix function route collector proxy group. So this can be our route group. And then we're just going to do app equals route setup for group require this routes. So route collector proxy, route collector, import that up top. And then finally, in our routes, we need to remove this reference to app too, because we're passing it route collector proxy sometimes. That's how we create route groups. So again, that support route remove app right there. We no longer need to import useLimApp. Sometimes we're not passing it the app, we're passing it the route collector proxy to define subroutes or routes that are underneath a given group. So we're going to say route group equals this prefix. Then we're going to say route collector proxy group. We're going to set up the routes and then we're going to require them. Next, we're going to get this middleware, and then we're going to say function middleware, and for each middleware we're going to add it to the given route group. Okay, and we need to do new middleware. Group add new middleware. Finally, we're going to reset the router to use the base app again instead of the group proxy. So within the route group, we need to set the router to use the group proxy. It's a proxy of the traditional router, but it's actually on this specific group. Then we need to loop through or walk through all of the middleware we pass in to be set on this group, and then we add each middleware to the given group. Once that is set up, which it looks like we're good to go there, we need to go to our providers. We need to go to route service provider. Within route service provider, we need to add a few things. So first we need to do, and here, let's do this real quick. Within our service provider, we're going to add a few new helpers. We're going to do public function bind. We're going to do key callable resolvable, and then we're just going to do this container set key and then resolvable, just like that. Of course, we need to go up here and we need to do this container equals this app get container, and then we need to do public. Let's do container interface and then container. Okay, so now we just have a helper function to make it easier to bind things to our service provider or to our container. Next, we're going to do public function resolve, and we're going to say key, and we're just going to do return this container get key, just like that. Okay, these are just two helpers to bind and resolve things from our container. Back in our route service provider, first thing we're going to do is we're going to do route setup, and we're simply going to say, okay, we're going to set up our router with this app so we can add route definitions on this app. Then we're going to bind a route group or the route group class. So we need to import the route group. Support/route group. And then we're binding the route group to a new instance of route group. This app. Just like that. So that's register. Next, what we want to do in our boot methods, we want to say this API route group register. This web route group register. and we want to completely get rid of all of these. So how's this work? Here's what we do. We do public function web route group. We're going to require that the type we return is of route group, and then we're going to do get equals routes path web.php. We're going to do add this resolve middleware. Remember, this is where there's a lot going on here, but just try to stay with me. We're resolving the middleware from our service container. So just like we bind something to our service container there, remember we set our middleware within our load HTTP middleware. The middleware is defined in our HTTP kernel. So we are just getting our kernel from our container. We set the middleware to our container within load HTTP middleware, and we're resolving the middleware that we set within our container within our route service provider using this resolve middleware. And the resolve helper just resolves something from our container. It gets something from our container. So we set it, and then we get it from our container. Here's what we're setting to our container, and then here is where we're getting it from our container. And it is, of course, the middleware. So all we want to do is we want to do this, is we want to do web equals this resolve a new route group. This will instantiate a new route group. That's that class we just created. The route group class has prefix, routes, middleware, register. Register just builds it all together and applies the middleware. So in our route service provider, we have our routes. Our routes are going to be defined here. So web.php are our routes. The middleware is going to be defined in our HTTP kernel. Right now, this is our global middleware, and then we want to add just the web middleware along with the global middleware. Then we have our new web group. And so all we're going to do is we're going to do web routes get prefix. Our web routes don't have any prefix. We'll leave that empty. And then middleware, we want to just get or just add our web middleware. So we'll get that and then our global middleware. And then we want to return that. And then we'll do the same thing for our API route group. So for API route group, we'll do this. Then we'll do API.php. And then we'll resolve this middleware. We need to get our API middleware. And then our prefix for our API routes are going to be API. And then we want to call this API routes. And then we want to do API routes. And with any luck, that should work. So now all we're doing is we're saying, okay, for the routes we load from the API.php file, we want to add the API and the global middleware. We want to prefix the routes defined right here with this API, and then we just want to register them. Same thing with web. We want to add the web middleware and the global middleware. We want to get the routes from routes path to web.php. The prefix will be empty because there doesn't need to be a prefix, and then we will register them. So that's how we add route groups. So now let's try that out. Before, after middleware. So check this out. The reason we have that before middleware and after middleware is because we have example after middleware, example before middleware. We add the middleware right here. This is our global middleware. So that setup was difficult, but this is what it does. We can literally just comment out these middleware right here. Before and after middleware, we reload the page, it goes away. Say we only want to add one of them. Example before middleware. We get before. Pretty cool stuff, right? So that's our global middleware. Say we only want to, let's add them both back real quick for one last example. So we add them both back, we have before and after middleware. Okay, so now let's go to our route/API. What was our route again? Example API controller at index. So if we go to example, what are we going to get? Well, we get the same template, right? That's weird. Why do we get the same template? Well, if we go to our web.php, the reason we get the same template is because this route has a parameter for the first name, so it thinks we're going here. So if we added like, I don't know, home/name, or maybe welcome/name, and then we reload this page, we'll get our whoops page. That's because the route's not found. API/example does not exist. Example does not exist. Why doesn't it exist though? Here's why it does not exist. We added this prefix in our API route group, and our route service provider, our API route group, has an API prefix. So we have to prefix our route with API. And there it goes. It exists. So now if we go back to our middleware, our kernel middleware, let's try this out. Let's get rid of our example after middleware and our example before middleware altogether. If we get rid of it, of course, it gets removed from there. Next, let's add it just to our API. So if we add it just to our API, we'll get on our API route group, but if we go to welcome Sam, it's not there. Of course, if we go back to API/example, it is there. It's because we added it to our API route group. The middleware is only on our API route group. If we move this and we do web.php, then it will only be on our web route group. So it's not on our API route group, but if we go to welcome/Sam, it is on our web route group. So this is some really, really cool stuff. And the kernel is a really powerful thing in general. It's a lot to take in, but it really sets it up to be phenomenal to work with. Just to give you an idea, some of the middleware we'll probably have to add later on is going to be like add errors to session for front end display middleware class. Like, I'm not making these very verbose, so you guys know what they would be. API would be limit requests to 60 per minute middleware class. Maybe format response as JSON request class. Stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of things that one group will need that another won't need. There's a bunch of things that we'll need to add globally. And there's a bunch of things that you want to add on routes specifically. So the only other thing I can think of right now is, we'll comment this out, is when we want to add middleware on a route group specifically, on a specific route, we can still use this add, and then we can do new example before middleware, just like that. And then that's going to be welcome name. Then we get before. Again, within our HTTP kernel, we have both of these commented out. So there's no middleware added in our kernel. Our HTTP kernel is for global middleware and route groups middleware, groups of route middleware. If we want to add it on a specific route, we just add it on the specific route. So guys, that is the HTTP kernel within Slim. Let me know what you guys think on this one. This one was a really in-depth tutorial. I hope I didn't lose too many people, but I'm also kind of curious to see what you guys are kind of thinking about these more in-depth tutorials. We're going a pretty fast pace, so we're not boring everybody to death, but it's some pretty cool stuff. So I'm really curious to hear your guys' feedback, and I would love to hear some opinions. If you guys like this, if you guys can't stand this kind of tutorial, if you guys, are like ooh, pretty, like it doesn't work or it's not really applicable, or if it is really applicable and you guys are being able to follow and go to the GitHub repo, which is linked to in the description, and it's working. Let me know, because I'm really trying to feel out how these more intensive tutorials are going, and I don't have too much of a clue. But if you made it this far, thanks for watching, guys. This is Zachary Horn with Clean Code Studio. Clean code, clean life, simplify. And next we will be getting on to the Eloquent ORM database query builder. I'm excited. See you guys next time.
Simple